I have a strange ability. Whenever someone doesn't love me, I can hear their thoughts, but my fiancé's mind had been completely silent for 2 years, until the night before our wedding, when I suddenly heard him think, she must never discover who I really am. I sat straight up in bed so fast the room tilted, my heart slamming against my ribs like it already knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Julian was asleep beside me, one arm thrown across the pillow, his breathing slow and even, completely unaware that for the first time in 2 years, I could hear him. That sentence doesn't make sense to anyone who hasn't lived inside my head. I've had this ability since I was 11 years old. I hear the thoughts of anyone who doesn't love me. Not everyone, not all the time, only the ones whose feelings toward me are hollow, performed, or absent entirely. Strangers on the street are a constant, meaningless static I've learned to tune out. Bad dates announce themselves within minutes, their polite smiles paired with thoughts about exit strategies and whether I'll expect them to pay. Even my own mother, on her worst days, used to leak thoughts I was never supposed to hear. Julian had been silent since the night we met. 2 full years of nothing, not one stray thought, not one crack in the quiet, the single longest, most peaceful silence I had ever lived inside. I used to lie awake some nights, just listening to the absence of him, the way you'd listen to a house finally settle after years of creaking. I had never let myself believe silence could mean something as simple and enormous as he actually loves me. Until 3 in the morning, the night before our wedding, when those 4 words cut through 2 years of peace like a blade through paper. She must never discover who I really am. If you've ever loved someone who felt like the safest silence you'd ever known, stay. This is the part where she finds out silence was never proof of anything at all. Subscribe now, because some in this video, everything you think you understand about what he's hiding will change. I looked down at him, at the face I was supposed to marry in 14 hours, and understood, with a dread that settled into my stomach like something with weight and teeth, that whatever I thought I knew about the man beside me had just become, in an instant, a question instead of a certainty. I didn't wake him. I sat there in the dark instead, replaying the sentence over and over, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion and wedding nerves had manufactured a thought that had never actually existed. But I knew my own ability too well for that particular lie to hold. This wasn't anxiety. This was Julian's voice, inside my head, clear as if he'd spoken it aloud, and it had arrived exactly once, and then gone silent again, the way a radio station cuts back to static after a single burst of signal. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and went to sit at the small desk in the corner of his apartment, the one covered in the last of our wedding paperwork, seating charts, a florist's invoice, a folder of vows I'd read 40 times and still hadn't managed to memorize without crying. I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't shaking them apart. That was when I noticed the drawer. It was the bottom one, the kind that sticks a little, the kind you'd only open if you were looking for something specific rather than idly rifling through a desk. I'd lived in this apartment on and off for a year and never once had a reason to open it. I told myself I still didn't have one. I opened it anyway. Inside was mostly what you'd expect. Old bank statements, a stack of birthday cards, a manual for a coffee maker we didn't own anymore. But tucked beneath all of it, pressed flat like it had been hidden rather than simply stored, was a photograph. Julian, younger, maybe 5 years younger, standing in front of a lake house I didn't recognize, his arm around a woman with dark hair and a smile that suggested whoever was taking the photo had just said something that made her genuinely happy. On her finger was a ring, not my ring, not the one currently sitting in a box in his sock drawer waiting for tomorrow, but a ring nonetheless, simple, silver, worn the way rings are worn by people who've had them on for a while. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize as Julian's, someone had written a date 5 years earlier, and beneath it, 2 words that made the room go very quiet around me in a way that had nothing to do with my ability and everything to do with ordinary human dread. Bristow Falls. I didn't know what that meant. I only knew that Julian had never once, in 2 years together, mentioned a lake house, a woman with dark hair, or a place called Bristow Falls, and that somewhere behind me, in the bed we were supposed to wake up in together as an engaged couple for the very last time, the man whose silence I had trusted more than I had ever trusted my own name was sleeping soundly, entirely unaware that the one night his mind had finally spoken to me, it had told me he was someone I didn't know at all. I put the photograph back exactly where I'd found it, closed the drawer, and sat on the edge of the desk chair until the sky outside started to lighten, running through every version of a conversation. I didn't know how to start.
Who is she?
Why do you have her ring in a drawer? Why does your handwriting remember a lake house you've never mentioned once in 2 years? Julian woke at 7, stretching, smiling at me with the easy, unguarded warmth I had built 2 years of trust around, and I smiled back like my whole chest wasn't a held breath. Big day, he said, kissing my forehead on his way to the shower. You okay? You look like you didn't sleep. Wedding nerves, I said, and the lie came out smoother than I expected, which frightened me almost as much as the photograph had. Over breakfast, I tried, carefully, to open a door without kicking it down. Have you ever been to Bristow Falls? I asked, watching his face over the rim of my coffee cup, waiting for the ability to tell me something my eyes couldn't. His hand stilled on the butter knife for exactly 1 second, barely anything, the kind of pause you'd miss if you weren't specifically looking for it, before he continued spreading jam like nothing had happened. Doesn't ring a bell. Why? I can't lose her too. The thought arrived and vanished so fast, I almost doubted I'd heard it, gone before I could catch the rest of the sentence, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that whatever silence I'd built my entire understanding of him around wasn't as solid as I'd believed, and enough to tell me that whoever he was afraid of losing, the fear was old, worn smooth with use, the kind of fear you carry so long it stops even registering as fear anymore. No reason, I said. Saw the name somewhere. Thought it sounded pretty. He didn't look up again. I spent the rest of breakfast watching him with a specific, quiet attention of someone cataloging a stranger, and by the time he left for his final tuxedo fitting, I had already decided I wasn't going to spend my wedding day not knowing who I was marrying. I called his best man, Theo, a college friend of Julian's who'd known him longer than I had, under the flimsy pretense of confirming toast logistics. Theo talked easily about groomsmen gifts and rehearsal dinner jokes for almost 10 minutes before I found an opening. Random question, I said, keeping my voice light. Did Julian grow up near a place called Bristow Falls? The silence on the line lasted just a beat too long. Where'd you hear that name? It came up. I don't really remember. I gripped the phone tighter. Theo, is there something about Julian's past I should know before tomorrow? That's not really my story to tell, he said, careful now, the easy warmth gone out of his voice entirely. You should ask him. I mean that. Ask him tonight before just ask him. He hung up before I could push further, and I stood in the middle of Julian's kitchen holding a phone that had just confirmed, without confirming anything at all, that whatever I'd found in that drawer wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding. That evening, while Julian was in the shower getting ready for the rehearsal dinner, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, screen lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. I shouldn't have looked. I looked anyway, and the notification banner was long enough to catch the first line of a voicemail transcription before the screen went dark again.
Julian, it's me.
I know it's been years. I need to talk to you before tomorrow. It's about. The message cut off there, the rest hidden behind a lock screen I didn't have the passcode for, and I stood frozen in his bedroom holding my own racing heartbeat in my chest, understanding that somewhere out there, less than 24 hours before I was supposed to marry him, a woman from Julian's past had chosen tonight, of all nights, to come looking for him. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself it was strategy, that a man who'd hidden something for 2 years wasn't going to hand me the truth an hour before a rehearsal dinner full of relatives who'd flown in specifically to watch us promise ourselves to each other. But if I'm honest, some of it was fear. I wasn't ready yet for whatever answer waited on the other side of the question, so instead, I did the only thing I knew how to do with fear. I turned it into research. I found Bristow Falls easily enough, a small town 4 hours north, population under 6,000, the kind of place that shows up in local news only for county fairs and, occasionally, tragedy. I typed Julian's name into the search bar first out of habit and got nothing useful, the same handful of results I'd already seen 100 times over 2 years, his current job a marathon he'd run 3 years ago, nothing that reached back further than that. It struck me then, in a way it hadn't before, how strange it was that a 32-year-old man had almost no digital footprint before the age of 27. People don't usually appear out of nothing. They just stop being easy to find. I typed the town's name alone instead, paired with the word missing, and the search returned an article from a regional paper, 5 years old, Headline blunt enough to stop my breath in my throat. Local woman presumed dead after disappearance near Bristow Falls. Fiancé questioned. Released without charges. The photograph accompanying the article was smaller, older, grainier than the one hidden in the desk drawer, but the face was unmistakable. Julian, 5 years younger, standing outside a courthouse with his hand shielding his eyes from a photographer, looking like a man who had already lost everything and was only now finding out how publicly he'd be made to lose it. The article named him. Not Julian Cole, the name I'd said out loud to a judge 14 years from now, but Julian Ashford, and named the woman who'd vanished as Elena Ashford, his fiancée of 3 years, last seen hiking alone near the falls the town was named for. Her body was never recovered. The investigation into Julian, extensive by the article's account, ended in his full clearance 8 months later, though the piece noted, almost as an afterthought, that public opinion in Bristow Falls had never fully cleared him the way the courts had. I sat with that for a long time, the cursor blinking at the end of an article about a man who had once been engaged to marry someone else, who had once stood at the center of a town's worst suspicion, who had changed his name and built an entirely new life 4 hours south of a lake his fiancée had disappeared into. I thought about the ring in the drawer, worn the way rings are worn by people who've had them on a while. I thought about she must never discover who I really am, and understood for the first time that the sentence might not have been about deception in the ordinary sense at all. It might have been about grief so large he'd built an entire second identity just to survive standing next to it. I was still staring at the screen when the thought came again, sharper this time, close enough that it felt less like overhearing and more like standing directly inside his fear. If Elena's really back, everything is about to fall apart. I sat up so fast my chair scraped hard against the floor. Not if people find out about Elena. Not if the past resurfaces. If Elena's really back, present tense, alive, a woman the article had called presumed dead 5 years ago, apparently walking back into her ex-fiancé's life on the exact night before he was supposed to marry someone else. I confronted him that night, not at the rehearsal dinner, not in front of 40 guests who'd flown and expecting a celebration, but afterward, back at the apartment, both of us still half-dressed in our rehearsal clothes, the photograph and the printed article laid out on the kitchen table between us like evidence in a trial neither of us had agreed to attend. Julian went very still when he saw them. Not surprised. I watched for surprise and didn't find it, only the specific, exhausted stillness of a man watching a wall he'd built for 5 years finally come down in front of the one person he'd built it to protect. Her name was Elena, he said quietly, sitting down across from me like the conversation required ballast. We were engaged. She went hiking alone near the falls one afternoon and never came back. They searched for 11 days. They never found a body, which meant they could never officially call it anything, not an accident, not a death, just an open case that never closed and a town that decided I must have been the reason it never would. You changed your name. I changed everything I could. My name, my address, every account with my old information on it. I told myself it was because I couldn't stand walking through a grocery store where people looked at me like I might be a murderer who'd simply never been proven guilty. Some of that's true. His hands, flat on the table, weren't quite steady. The rest of it is that I couldn't stand being the man Elena disappeared on. I thought if I became someone else entirely, I could stop being the person who let the last real conversation we ever had be an argument about whether she should even be hiking alone that day. The voicemail, I said. Julian, is she alive? He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, my ability did something it had never done before. Instead of one sharp fragment cutting through, I heard a slow, unraveling stream of thought, quieter than speech but unmistakable, the sound of a man finally letting himself think the thing he'd spent years refusing to. I don't know how to tell her that some part of me has been waiting 5 years for a phone to ring exactly like it rang tonight. Julian. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Answer me. I don't know, he said, and this time I couldn't tell if he was lying to me or to himself. The voicemail didn't say. It just said she needed to talk before tomorrow, and gave a place, and I've spent the last 6 hours trying to decide whether going there tonight to find out makes me a monster for doubting you, or a coward for not telling you the second it came in. The doorbell rang before I could answer. 3 sharp knocks that cut through the apartment louder than either of us had spoken all night, and Julian's face went the color of paper. Don't answer that, he said, already moving toward it anyway, some instinct pulling him forward faster than his own warning could stop him. I followed him to the door, my pulse loud enough to drown out even my own ability, and watched him open it to a woman standing on the threshold in a coat too thin for the weather, dark hair pulled back, a face I'd only seen before in a 5-year-old photograph, and a grainy newspaper article. "Hello, Julian," she said. "I know this is the worst possible night. I need 5 minutes, and then I promise I'll disappear again, if that's what you want." Elena Ashford was alive, and she was standing in the doorway of the apartment where I was supposed to wake up tomorrow as a bride. Nobody moved for a long moment. Julian stood frozen in the doorway like a man who'd spent 5 years rehearsing this exact scenario in his head and had still, somehow, arrived at it completely unprepared. I stood behind him, close enough to see Elena's face clearly for the first time outside a photograph, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not jealousy, not yet, but a strange, unwilling recognition, the specific vertigo of meeting a ghost who turns out to have been breathing the entire time. "You should probably let me explain before either of you decides what this is," Elena said, and her voice had the careful, over-rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech in a car for hours before finding the nerve to knock. We sat in the living room, the three of us arranged in a triangle none of us had chosen, and Elena told a story that unwound 5 years of my fiancé's grief into something far more complicated than a hiking accident. "I didn't disappear because of an accident," she said. "I disappeared because my father owed money to people who didn't accept late payments as an excuse, and 2 weeks before I vanished, one of them made it clear that if the debt wasn't settled, they'd find another way to collect, through me, through anyone close enough to hurt him with." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't tell Julian because he would have tried to fix it the way he tries to fix everything, and it would have gotten him killed instead of just heartbroken. So I staged a disappearance instead. Hiking gear left at the trailhead, a note I never sent, a 5-year silence I maintained by becoming someone easier to lose than to find." She looked at Julian, and something in her expression cracked open, old and unhealed. "My father's debt was settled 8 months ago. The people who threatened us are in federal custody now, unrelated case. Nothing to do with me directly, but it meant I was finally safe to exist again under my own name. I saw the engagement announcement in a mutual friend's messages 3 weeks ago. I told myself I wasn't going to come. I kept telling myself that, right up until tonight. "You let me believe you were dead," Julian said, his voice raw in a way I'd never heard it. "You let an entire town believe I killed you. You let me carry that for 5 years, Elena, when you could have found some way. I know." Her voice broke on it. "I know, and I don't have a version of this where that forgiveness is owed to me instead of earned. I'm not here to ask for it. I'm here because I needed you to know the truth before you married someone else believing a lie about who let you down and why." I sat there, absorbing a story that had just rewritten 5 years of my fiancé's history in real time, and felt the strange, dislocating weight of being both the intended audience for a confession and completely irrelevant to the two people making it. Julian's ability to hurt me hadn't come from betrayal, not exactly. It had come from grief he'd never let himself finish, grief that had apparently been waiting, fully alive, for exactly this knock on the door. "I need air," I said, standing before either of them could stop me, and walked out onto the apartment balcony alone, my hands gripping the railing hard enough to hurt, trying to process the fact that tomorrow's wedding suddenly felt less like a certainty and more like a question none of us had finished answering. That was when I heard it, not a thought this time, something worse, something real. A car engine, idling too long in the parking lot below, headlights angled toward the building in a way that felt deliberate rather than incidental. I leaned over the railing and saw 2 men sitting in the front seats, unmoving, watching the entrance with the specific patience of people who weren't waiting for a delivery. Elena's voice came from behind me, quiet and frightened in a way that had nothing to do with old grief. "Oh God," she said, following my gaze down to the parking lot. "That's them. That's the car. I thought this was over. I thought I was finally safe to come back. 5 years of hiding, and the danger followed her straight to the one door she thought was finally safe to knock on." Drop a comment telling me what you'd do in Elena's position, and subscribe to Eternal Novels so you don't miss what happens when Julian decides who he's protecting tonight. Julian was beside us on the balcony before I'd finished processing what Elena had said, his gaze locked on the same car, his jaw tightening in a way that told me he already understood exactly what we were looking at. "You said they were settled," he said to Elena, low and urgent. "You said federal custody, unrelated case." "I thought they were." Her voice had gone thin with panic. "There were more of them than just the ones who got arrested. I didn't think the rest would care enough to follow me somewhere I wasn't even supposed to still be connected to. If they find her here, Ren could get hurt too." The thought arrived clear and sharp, cutting through my own fear with a force that told me, more than anything Julian had said out loud all night, exactly where his priorities had settled the second real danger showed up on our doorstep. Not confusion. Not divided loyalty. Fear, specifically, for me, layered directly on top of fear for a woman he'd spent 5 years grieving. "We need to call the police," I said, already reaching for my phone, my hands steadier than I expected them to be.
Now.
"Not in 5 minutes, not after we figure out a better plan."
Now.
"If they see police, they'll bolt before anyone can connect them to anything," Elena said. "And then they'll just try again somewhere with fewer witnesses." "I don't care about building a case tonight," I said. "I care about getting everyone in this apartment through the next hour, without anyone getting hurt. Those are different problems, and we're solving mine first." Something in my voice must have carried more authority than I felt, because both of them stopped arguing and let me dial. The dispatcher's calm, practiced questions steadied me in a way I hadn't expected, walking me through details I recited almost mechanically. Address, description of the vehicle, the fact that a woman inside the apartment believed she was being targeted by individuals connected to a prior federal investigation. While we waited, Julian pulled every blind in the apartment shut and moved us away from the windows, and in the sudden, close darkness of the living room, I found myself standing beside a fiancé whose entire history I'd learned in the span of one impossible night, and a woman who, 5 years ago, had loved him first. "I'm sorry," Julian said to me, quietly, while Elena kept watch near the window's edge.
For all of it.
"For the silence, for letting you build a wedding on top of a version of me that wasn't the whole truth. I told myself I was protecting you from something ugly. I think mostly I was protecting myself from having to say it out loud. You can apologize properly once we're not hiding from a car full of strangers," I said, though something in me had already started, cautiously, to believe him. Red and blue light swept briefly across the closed blinds a few minutes later, and I heard, faintly, through the window, the sound of car doors, raised voices, the particular authority of officers doing exactly the job I'd called them to do. It wasn't over. Not the danger. Not the questions Elena's reappearance had opened, not the 5 years of grief Julian had never let himself finish, but for the first time since I'd woken up hearing a thought that shouldn't have existed, I let myself believe we might actually make it to morning. Then my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and the message on the screen made the small relief I'd just allowed myself collapse entirely. "Tell your fiancé, this isn't finished. He knows exactly what we're actually here to collect, and it was never about the girl who ran." Julian read the text over my shoulder, and whatever color had returned to his face after the officers arrived drained out of it a second time. "They think I still have it," he said quietly, more to himself than to either of us. "Have what?" I said. "Julian, what is he talking about?" He sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, rubbing both hands over his face. Before Elena disappeared, her father came to me. He knew I'd been quietly looking into the people he owed money to, trying to find some kind of leverage that might get them to back off instead of escalating. I found something: financial records, transfers, enough documentation to make a fraud case against 2 of them if it ever got into the right hands. He asked me to hold on to it, keep it somewhere separate from him in case anything happened and someone needed proof of what these people had actually done.
His jaw tightened.
Then Elena vanished, and I got questioned for her disappearance instead of anyone asking about the records I was sitting on, and I panicked. I put the drive somewhere safe and told myself I'd deal with it once the investigation into me was over. Then I changed my name, moved, tried to forget the entire chapter of my life existed. I never destroyed it. I just stopped thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about a wound once the bandage covers it well enough. "You've had evidence against these people for 5 years, Elena said, staring at him. "This whole time, while I was hiding, rebuilding an entire life under an assumed name because I thought there was no way to make them stop. I didn't know if it was still relevant. I didn't know if using it would put you in more danger instead of less, wherever you actually were. I made a call I told myself was protecting people, and now I'm starting to understand it might have just been protecting myself from having to be brave again. He looked at both of us, and something in his face had finally gone fully honest, stripped of 5 years of careful management. It's still where I left it. A safety deposit box, under a name that doesn't exist on paper anymore except in that one drawer. The lead officer, once briefed on all of it, took the information with a flat, practiced calm of someone who'd clearly heard stranger confessions delivered at stranger hours, and within 40 minutes, a plan was in motion that involved federal agents, a warrant executed before dawn, and 2 men picked up 3 blocks from the apartment before they'd made it back to whatever vehicle they'd arrived in. It wasn't clean. It wasn't over by sunrise, not fully. There would be statements to give, follow-up interviews, a case that would take months to fully close, evidence that would need Julian's testimony alongside records he'd been too frightened to hand over for 5 years. But by the time the sky outside the apartment window had gone from black to gray, the immediate danger had a name, a file number, and 2 men in custody instead of a car idling in a parking lot. Elena left around 5 in the morning, declining the offer of a couch, saying she needed somewhere quiet to sit with everything that had just happened. At the door, she turned back to me, not to Julian, and said the one thing I hadn't expected from her all night. "I'm not here to take anything from you," she said. "I came to give him back the truth. What he does with it, and who he decides to build a life with while carrying it, that part was never mine to interfere with." She glanced past me toward Julian, something old and complicated moving across her face. "Take care of him. He's better at protecting other people than he ever learned to be at letting himself be protected." She was gone before I could figure out how to respond, and I stood in the doorway of an apartment that had held, in a single impossible night, a 5-year-old grief, a stranger's confession, a threat with a name and a case number, and somewhere underneath all of it, the fragile, undecided question of whether I still wanted to walk down an aisle in 6 hours. I didn't sleep before the wedding. Neither did Julian. We sat together on the balcony as the sun came up, both of us still in the clothes we'd been wearing when the police arrived, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all, which felt, after a night like that, like its own kind of honesty. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said finally. "If you need more time, if you need to postpone, cancel, whatever this needs to be, I will understand, and I will not make you feel guilty for needing it. I've spent 5 years building an entire identity around not being brave enough to tell the truth. I'm not going to compound that by pressuring you into a wedding you're not sure about anymore." I thought about the 2 years of silence I'd trusted so completely, the years I'd mistaken for the whole truth instead of understanding them as a truth he'd only been able to offer once he'd buried the rest of himself deep enough to forget it was there. I thought about the version of love I'd built my entire ability around, the idea that silence meant safety, that the absence of intrusive thought was proof enough of devotion. I understood now, sitting on that balcony with the sun coming up on the worst and strangest night of my life, that I'd been wrong about what the silence actually meant. "Your mind wasn't quiet because you loved me perfectly," I said slowly, working it out loud as I said it. "It was quiet because you'd buried the part of yourself that could hurt me, along with the part of yourself that could hurt anyone, including you. I didn't fall in love with the whole truth of you. I fell in love with the parts you'd let survive." I turned to look at him fully. "I want to marry the whole version. Not the one who goes silent to protect me. The one who tells me things even when it's terrifying, especially when it's terrifying, starting today." He didn't say anything for a moment, and in that silence, real silence now, the ordinary kind, not the ability-shaped kind I'd spent 2 years mistaking for something sacred, I watched him decide, visibly, to try. "Then I need to tell you something else before you say yes to that," he said. "Elena and we were together 3 years before she disappeared. I loved her the way you love your first real love, entirely, without any protection built in yet. When I met you, I told myself I was starting over completely. I don't think that's true anymore. I think I brought all of it with me, and I let you build a life next to a man who'd never actually finished grieving what he lost. That's not fair to you, and it's not something one apology fixes. I'm asking you to marry someone who's going to keep working on that, not someone who's already finished." We got married 4 hours later, in front of guests who had no idea what the night before the wedding had actually held, in a ceremony that felt, underneath its ordinary joy, like the beginning of an entirely different kind of promise than the one I'd walked in expecting to make. I didn't hear a single thought from him the entire ceremony, not the old silence, the trusting, uncomplicated kind, but a new one, quieter and more deliberate, the silence of a man choosing, moment to moment, to say the true things out loud instead of letting them stay buried where my ability would never have to find them. I still hear thoughts sometimes, from people whose love for me is hollow or absent or performed. I've learned, since that night, that the reverse isn't always true. That silence isn't proof of a perfect love, only proof of a love that hasn't yet been tested hard enough to crack. Julian's mind goes quiet with me most days now, and I've stopped needing that quiet to mean everything. Some nights, when something frightens him, I still hear a stray fragment slip through, small and human and unfinished, and instead of dread, I've learned to feel something closer to gratitude, proof that he's still choosing, every day, to let me hear him at all. Did Julian earn a second chance after 5 years of silence, or should she have walked away at the altar? Comment he earned it, or she deserved better. And Elena, brave for finally telling the truth, or should she have stayed gone and let them build their life, without her showing up first? Comment she did the right thing, or she should have stayed away. Tell me what you would have done in her shoes. I read every single one. If this story kept your heart racing, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Eternal Novel drops a new betrayal and power reversal story every week, and the next one might just be the one you've been waiting for. Like this video, drop your prediction in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.